My name is Helen. I'm 54 years old, and I've been married to Richard for almost 30 years. Sometimes I wonder if what unites us today is still love or just a collection of habits that have become stronger than affection. Our house is quiet, organized, predictable. Every object seems to know its place, and every silence, its moment. There's something comforting about this routine, but also something suffocating. It's a peace that sounds hollow, like an echo in an empty room. Richard has always been a man of restrained gestures. He was never one to talk much, nor easily angered. In recent months, however, something in him has changed. Not in a way one would notice at first glance, but in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. He's different. Kinder, more patient. And, paradoxically, more distant. His kindnesses now seem calculated, his hugs have become formal gestures, and his gaze, that gaze that once pierced me, now seems to stop before meeting mine. At first, I thought it was all in my head. Menopause, perhaps. The empty house after the children had gone their separate ways. Or just the weight of years spent together, which makes love more silent. But over time, the distance took shape. It was no longer absence, it was too much of a presence elsewhere. It was on a normal night, one of those we call quiet, that something inside me began to really suspect. We were having dinner, as always, face to face at the same wooden table we'd had since our first apartment. He spoke little, ate slowly. I tried to make conversation, but his answers came automatically, like an echo from far away. Then his phone vibrated. Just a single ring. He glanced at the screen and frowned, a quick but noticeable movement.
"I'll be right back."
He said this without looking at me, standing up with his cell phone in hand. He walked to the hallway and entered the bathroom, locking the door behind him. I heard the sound of the running faucet, a constant noise, as if trying to drown out something. And then his voice, low, restrained, as if speaking in secret. That scene lasted less than 2 minutes, but it was enough to awaken something I'd been trying to ignore for weeks. When he got up from the table, I saw the name appear on the screen, Tire Shop. It sounds trivial, I know. It could have been any call, an emergency, a collection. But there was something strange about the way he acted. Richard always answered work calls in front of me, sometimes even putting them on speakerphone. But now, a simple call required the bathroom and the tap running. I pretended not to notice. I continued eating in silence, but my mind was no longer on the table. He returned minutes later, with the same neutral expression, and said it was the car thing. I smiled, but deep down I already knew. An overly generic answer is the kind of answer born of a lie. In the following days, I began to observe. Not with desperation, but with that tense calm of someone who feels they're about to confirm something they don't want to know. I noticed he'd changed his cell phone password. He'd started taking calls in another room, and every time the phone vibrated, his gaze would shift to me. Curiously, he was more attentive to me. He made coffee, complimented me on dinner, asked if I was okay. A sudden, almost rehearsed kindness. Kindness is the most polite mask for guilt. One morning when he went out to take care of some things, I noticed his car was still the same dirty one, with the tire he'd said needed changing for weeks. The tire shop seemed to exist only on his phone. I could have asked, but I didn't. I've learned that sometimes, when we ask too many questions, people shape their answers to fit our expectations. I chose to observe. And the more I observed, the more the pieces began to move in strange ways. One night, while he was sleeping, his phone vibrated on his nightstand. The notification read, "New media received, Tire Shop." No preview, no image. As if the message had been deleted. My heart raced. I didn't open it, but I didn't sleep again that night. In the following days, I noticed other details. He started wearing a new perfume, but said it was the same as always. He kept his cell phone face down, avoiding keeping it away from his body. And every time I asked something simple, "How was your day?" or "Did you fix the car problem?" he responded with a tone that was too light, almost playful. as if trying to disguise discomfort with humor. That's when I realized our conversations had turned into monologues. I talked, he listened. I asked questions, he deflected. And even when he answered, it wasn't me he was answering. It was himself, trying to maintain a balance between what he wanted to hide and what he needed to appear. What scared me wasn't the possibility of betrayal. It was the feeling of slowly losing someone, like watching a painting fade over time. Love doesn't die all at once. It gradually fades into silence, averted glances, brief conversations, and automatic smiles. That night, when he stood up again during dinner, his phone vibrating in his hand, I realized the scene was repeating itself with almost choreographed precision. He glanced at the screen, hesitated, and went to the bathroom. The faucet turned on. The same low murmur echoed off the walls. And this time, I didn't look away. I stood there, staring at the empty chair, the still half-eaten plate, and the constant sound of running water. I thought about how many times this had happened without me noticing. How many conversations had been hidden under the guise of normalcy. When he returned, he brought a slight, almost rehearsed smile.
It was the mechanic, nothing major.
I nodded in agreement, saying nothing. But inside me, something had already changed. It was no longer curiosity. It was a kind of silent vigil, a waiting that feeds on silence itself. In the days that followed, I realized that the sound of the faucet had become a kind of secret code between us, a warning that he was, once again, hiding something. Every time the water ran, something inside me also slipped away. Patience, trust, and little by little, the illusion that I still knew the man I slept with every night. But one morning, something changed. Richard rushed out, saying he needed to take care of something quick at the shop. The car was still in the garage when I heard his cell phone ringing on the nightstand. The name on the screen was the same, Tire Shop. Only this time it wasn't a message. It was a voice recording. I stood there staring at the screen. I hesitated. Then I pressed play. The voice was male, young, and for some reason, familiar.
Mr. Richard, I'm trying to resolve this, but they won't wait until Friday.
My body reacted before my mind. I felt my stomach tighten, a distant memory wanting to emerge, but without form. That voice. There was something about it I recognized, but didn't want to admit. I quickly turned off the audio, as if the mere act of listening was a betrayal. I stood there, staring at the reflection of my phone on the table, trying to figure out if what I felt was jealousy, fear, or something as yet unnamed. From that moment on, the sound of the faucet took on a new meaning. It was no longer just a cover for a conversation. It was a reminder that something big was being hidden within that house. And perhaps the truth was much closer than I imagined. At first, I really tried not to overthink it. Richard had always been reserved about work, careful with what he said, methodical even in the way he closed the door when he left. But suddenly, that reserve seemed to have turned into secrecy. Mornings became more rushed, and the sound of the garage opening too early began to wake me before my alarm. He would leave saying he needed to get some work done, and return later, as if the old routine had become too small for what he now concealed. At dinner, his chair began to creak on its own. The cutlery clattered against the plate, and the noise seemed to fill the space of conversations that had vanished. When I asked him why he was in such a good mood, he smiled too lightly and simply said, "I took care of some unfinished business." That word kept lingering in my mind. Unfinished business. It sounded like something he didn't want to say in full. I knew the tone of voice he used when he spoke the truth, and this wasn't one of them. I tried to convince myself it was nonsense. Maybe a new project, maybe something with the car, maybe even a favor for someone. But the small changes began to repeat themselves with disturbing precision. The phone was never in the same place, the password changed. His perfume now had a woody note I'd never smelled before. Small, almost invisible details, but the kind of details a wife notices. It wasn't jealousy. I know the bitter taste of jealousy, and I knew what I felt was different. It was a kind of quiet restlessness, a voice inside me telling me there was something stirring beneath the surface, something it was trying to keep still. One night, while washing dishes, I heard my phone vibrate on the counter. He was in the living room, distracted by the news. The name flashed quickly on the screen. Tire shop. The same name I'd seen that night. The message disappeared before I could read it, but my heart raced as if I'd understood something my brain couldn't yet explain. Over the next few days, I began to notice, almost involuntarily. His departure times no longer matched his return times, his clothes smelled of coffee that wasn't from around here, and the car, the one he kept saying he needed to take to the shop, still had the same worn tire. One afternoon, after he left, I found his gas receipt in the glove compartment. There was nothing unusual about it, except for the address. It wasn't the way to work or the shop. It was in a neighborhood on the other side of town. That sparked something inside me. A desire to understand, to see with my own eyes. I wasn't the kind of woman to dig, but the feeling of being left out of my own life was stronger than any pride. The next morning, Richard left in a hurry as usual, saying he had a meeting. I waited a few minutes and, for the first time, followed him. I kept my distance, just enough to avoid being seen. He drove slowly, the radio off, his eyes fixed on the road. When he stopped, I parked a little further back. The place wasn't a workshop. It was a small coffee shop, with a blue facade and a sign faded by time. I watched him enter and greet someone. And then, for the first time, I felt a chill run down my spine. He wasn't alone. From the window, I could only see the profile of the person waiting for him. A young, thin figure leaning against the wall. The way they leaned toward each other made me gasp. There was no touching, no hugging, but something intimate about the gesture. He seemed tense, and she, understanding. They stood there for a few minutes, talking quietly. When Richard left, he didn't look around. He got back in his car, started the engine, and drove off. I stood there, watching the young woman cross the street and disappear around a nearby corner. I waited a few moments before approaching. The cafe seemed empty, and the waiter was absent-mindedly wiping tables. I asked if he knew the man who had just left. He looked at me and replied,
"Yes, of course. He comes often. He usually pays for the coffee of the guy who sits next to him."
Boy, not woman. And suddenly, everything I'd seen took on a new tone. Neither relief nor guilt. Just more questions. Who was that boy? Why was he lying about this? I walked back to the car with trembling hands. The engine sounded louder than usual. I didn't know it yet, but this encounter would be the first thread pulled from a much larger ball of yarn. And I was about to discover that what Richard was hiding wasn't exactly what I feared. It was something deeper, more familiar. I decided to observe, but without letting it show. After so many years together, I knew that if he noticed my gaze changing, he'd find a better way to hide it. So I feigned distraction. I continued with my usual routine of coffee on the table, light-hearted questions, automatic smiles, but inside, everything inside me was on alert. The next morning, while he was showering, I grabbed his cell phone from the dresser. The contact information for tire shop was still there, but something caught my attention. The number had no area code. Unusual for a company, especially one he claimed was in the central region. It was a short, dry number, and it made me uneasy. I closed the phone before he left the bathroom, trying to ignore my racing heart. That night, as he fell asleep, the same number appeared on the screen. The notification said, "New media received," but no visible message. No text, no image. Just the warning and a silence that weighed more heavily than any words. I wanted to open it, but I couldn't. Not out of fear of what I would find, but because I sensed that, from the moment I knew, nothing would ever be the same again. The following days were a succession of minor annoyances. He started coming out more dressed up, wearing a cologne I'd never seen in the bathroom, and talking with strange enthusiasm about work resolutions. One afternoon, while he was talking on the phone, I noticed his voice was different. Softer, almost too gentle. When I asked who he was, he answered quickly, almost laughing. "The guy from the garage, he's a bit of a mess." On Saturday, he said he needed to fix something with his car. He left early, unhurriedly, and returned hours later, his shirt wrinkled and smelling of a perfume that wasn't mine. The car was exactly as dirty as before, with a worn tire, the same scratch on the side. No sign of a repair shop, no receipt. Just silence, and a look that shifted when I asked him, "Did everything work out?" He responded with that same slight, automatic smile that had already become a wall between us. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at my half-empty glass of wine and the clock ticking down on a marriage that was beginning to unravel. I didn't want to believe I was being betrayed, but I also didn't know how to pretend it wasn't happening anymore. The pieces were there, but none of them quite fit together. It was then, as I was collecting the clothes from the line, that I noticed something in his pants pocket. A small, folded piece of paper with the logo of a coffee shop. The address was in a distant neighborhood, on the other side of the city, a place we'd never been together. On the back was a quick, almost illegible scribble, like a hasty reminder, Saturday, 10 a.m. I tucked the paper between the pages of a book and, for the first time, decided I wouldn't wait any longer for answers. Next Saturday, I would find out what was really going on and who, after all, was in such dire need of fixing. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Part of me wanted answers, but another part, familiar with the tone of his voice and the way he looked away, knew that if I pressed him, he'd come up with something convincing enough to make me doubt myself. So I remained silent. And it was in that silence that the house began to change. His chair began to remain empty longer, his towel hung in the bathroom until the next day, and the forgotten coffee cup on the sink became part of the decor. Everything seemed carefully placed, as if he wanted to leave a trace of his presence while, in fact, he was absent in fragments. At night, the sound of silverware against plate mingled with the sound of the wall clock, and time seemed to slow down. I felt like that tranquility was a performance, a way of avoiding the obvious. One night, I lay next to him and closed my eyes, pretending to sleep. Almost immediately, I heard the familiar sound of his cell phone vibrating. He moved slowly, picked up the phone, and went to the bathroom. He locked the door, and the sound of the faucet mixed with his muffled words. This time, the water couldn't hide everything. I heard a short, nervous laugh, and then a low voice.
"I'll deal with it tomorrow."
That sentence stuck in my head, echoing like an echo. What did he need to resolve? And with whom? Over the next few days, the pattern repeated itself. The same hurried departures, the same controlled mood, the same neutral excuses. The contact tire shop appeared on the screen with irritating frequency, always at night, always at the same time. But something different happened on Thursday. When he left his phone on the dresser and went outside to take a call, it vibrated again. I glanced at it without touching it, and a notification flashed briefly before disappearing. Arrived earlier than expected. I stood there, watching the reflection of the screen go blank, as if the phone itself knew I'd seen enough to keep me from sleeping peacefully. And for the first time, I realized that perhaps the silence between us wasn't just an absence of words anymore. It was the harbinger of something that, one way or another, was already underway. The next day, he woke before me. I heard the shower running and the familiar sound of water hitting the tile. His cell phone sat on the dresser, vibrating slightly every few seconds, as if purposefully getting my attention. I tried to ignore it. I swear I did. But curiosity, when coupled with fear, has an almost physical power. I got up, walked over to the phone, and picked it up. The screen lit up, and there it was, tire shop. For a moment, I considered letting it go, putting the phone back and pretending nothing had happened. But the notification still pulsated, stubbornly begging to be read. I took a deep breath, opened the message, and read it slowly, as if the words were poison. "Thanks for yesterday." He calmed down after our conversation. I felt a chill run down my arms. My palms were sweating. The bathroom still echoed with the sound of running water, as if giving me time to decide what to do with it. Who was he? And what was all this talk about? The first thing I thought of was the obvious. Someone else, maybe a friend, maybe someone's child, maybe someone who wasn't just a disguised name. I locked the screen before he left and went back to bed. I pretended to sleep. He came into the room minutes later, whistling, drying his hair with a towel. He acted as if nothing had happened. And, in a way, it hadn't. During coffee, I observed his every gesture. The way he stirred the sugar in his cup. The way he avoided looking at me for more than 2 seconds. Everything seemed rehearsed. I asked, in a neutral tone, "Did you solve everything at the workshop yesterday?" He hesitated for a split second.
Ah, yes. I was sorting out some things with the guy there.
The same one who called you yesterday?
Yes, that one.
He smiled, too quickly. I remained silent like someone guarding a piece of evidence. The rest of the day passed in a kind of normality that felt increasingly artificial to me. That night, he went to bed early. I lay awake, lying on my side, staring at his phone on the nightstand. The urge to know was unbearable, but the fear of confirming anything was even greater. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. In the middle of the night, the phone vibrated again. I grabbed it before he woke up. It was a new message, from the same number. Same time tomorrow. He needs to hear this again. The he kept coming back, and now it was accompanied by a strange familiarity. That way of writing, direct, careful, reminded me of someone. But I couldn't place it. The next day, Richard left earlier than usual. I waited a few minutes and then called the number. My heart was pounding so loudly it almost drowned out the sound of the call. 1, 2, 3 attempts. On the 4th, someone answered.
Hello.
The voice was male, young, trembling. I couldn't answer right away. That voice, there was something about it that stopped me. Familiar, yet distant. A sound that seemed from another time.
Hello? Can you hear me?
He repeated impatiently. I hung up without saying anything. I stood there with the phone in my hand, my heart racing, the sound of the faucet still echoing inside my head as a reminder that nothing was resolved. When Richard returned home, he seemed so calm. He brought me flowers, after months without a single gesture. He said he'd thought of me when he passed the flower shop. I smiled and accepted, but inside, everything was spinning. As I was placing the flowers in a vase, I saw something attached to the stem. A small note, written hastily, in the same handwriting as the message on the cell phone. He will understand. My blood ran cold. I didn't know if the message was for me, for him, or for someone who hadn't yet fully entered the story. But I was sure of one thing. The truth was getting closer, and more confusing. That night, during dinner, the sound of cutlery hitting the plate seemed louder than ever. The smell of food was the same, but something in the air was different. The silence between us had become almost physical, an invisible wall separating two people who no longer knew how to talk. I waited for him to finish taking a sip of wine and asked, in a light, almost distracted tone, "Did you solve the problem with the car?" He hesitated for only a second, but it was enough. His gaze wavered, and that brief interval between question and answer confirmed it to me more than any words could.
Ah, yes, yes. It was just the rear tire.
I smiled. A practiced, restrained smile, just like his. Inside, however, I felt the air growing dense, heavy. I didn't insist. I let him believe I didn't know, because that was exactly what I wanted. From then on, I began observing every movement, every involuntary gesture. The way he straightened in his chair when his phone vibrated, the way he wiped his mouth with a napkin to buy time before answering something simple. Over the next few days, I continued to feign normalcy. The same questions, the same short answers. But now, I paid attention to the details he forgot to keep track of. He claimed to have gone to the shop, but the car was clean and undamaged. He said he was coming back from work, but the GPS showed different routes. Little by little, I began to map his invisible steps, tracing a routine that no longer fit with the life we had. On Thursday, I decided to give it a try. I casually asked if he could drive me downtown on Saturday, since I wanted to buy a gift for my sister. He responded quickly.
Oh, Saturday. That won't work. I have an early appointment.
Commitment. A short, dangerous word, spoken in a tone that tried to sound light but didn't hide the discomfort. I pretended not to notice, just nodded and smiled. That night, as he slept, I checked his phone again. No new messages from the tire shop. No calls. For a moment, I almost thought it might all be paranoia. But as I placed the phone on the table, I noticed something I'd never seen before. A newly created photo folder. The name was generic, Backup 2. I opened it. The pictures were old, of our home, our children, our travels. But among them, one photo stood out. It was recent, taken in a place I didn't recognize. Richard was sitting in a coffee shop, the same one from the receipt I'd found days earlier. In front of him, a figure partially cut off by the edge of the image. I couldn't see the face, but there was a young arm, a black bracelet, and a mug identical to the one he always used here at home. My heart raced. I closed the briefcase and put my phone back in the same place, silently. The sound of the wind hitting the window seemed to be the only real noise that night. I went back to bed and watched him sleep peacefully, breathing deeply, as if the weight of a secret could be dissolved in sleep. But I knew that photo was no coincidence. On Saturday morning, he left in a hurry, saying he'd be back for lunch. The words were accompanied by a light kiss and a quick smile. I waited a few minutes, long enough for him to believe I hadn't even noticed his haste. I grabbed the car keys and followed, keeping a safe distance. He drove through the city as if following a well-rehearsed script. No detours, no hesitation. He seemed to know exactly where he was going. When he parked, I slowed down and parked a little further back. It was a discreet corner cafe, the kind that seems invisible to hurried passers-by. From inside the car, I watched. He spent a few minutes on his cell phone, looking around, as if waiting for someone. Then, someone approached. I couldn't see his face. The light was hitting the glass, and the distance made everything blurry. I only noticed that the conversation started immediately, and that there was no formality between them. His body spoke louder than words. He gestured intensely, a rarity for someone who had always been restrained. He touched his face, looked at the ground, then fixed his gaze on the other person as if trying to convince them. It wasn't a business conversation, nor a casual encounter. It was something more personal and urgent. I stood there, watching from afar, trying to piece together the puzzle from invisible fragments. After a few minutes, he pulled something from his pocket, a manila envelope, folded in half. He handed it over carefully. The other person took it and stood up immediately. Richard sat for a few moments, motionless, as if the weight of that gesture had left him empty. When he returned home, he had the same calm expression as always. He was carrying fresh bread, talking about the traffic, the line at the garage. Everything was perfectly normal. Almost convincing. During lunch, I observed him calmly. He avoided eye contact but tried to appear present. He talked about trivialities, laughed at random comments, as if the morning had been ordinary. I simply nodded, letting him believe his act was working. Later, while washing the dishes, I noticed something unusual on the table. A crumpled piece of paper, forgotten next to his wallet. I picked it up carefully, opening it slowly. It was a receipt from the same coffee shop he'd been at. On the back, a handwritten note in his handwriting. Monday, at 3. Bring the rest. My heart sank. The rest of what? I thought. And who else was involved in this? That night, as he slept, his phone vibrated once. I glanced at it. Tire shop. The preview message simply said, "He asked you not to mention anything to her." My blood ran cold. There was no denying. There was someone else in this story. But for the first time, something inside me whispered that maybe this someone else wasn't who I imagined. But there was something that confused me. He didn't have the look of a guilty man. On the contrary, he seemed tired. A weariness that didn't come from his body, but from within, like someone carrying the weight of something they can't say. After each outing, he returned lighter, almost serene, as if the silence between us was the only place he could still rest. Over the next few days, I began to notice details that hadn't previously caught my attention. The way he stared into space while stirring his coffee, the way he sighed before answering simple questions. Sometimes, he seemed to want to say something but swallowed it. Other times, he watched me as if gauging my reaction before saying anything. One of those mornings, while tidying my room, I found the envelope he'd given me at the coffee shop. It was folded inside a book, almost carelessly hidden. There was a bank stamp and a cash deposit receipt. No name, but the amount was too high to be just a mechanical pending. My heart raced. I put the envelope away and tried to act natural. When he came home that night, I mentioned that we needed to review our finances. Bills, invoices, expenses. He looked away, fiddling with his wristwatch, and calmly replied,
"It's all under control, Helen. I've already taken care of it."
Of it. A small word, but loaded. He didn't say what, just this. And then I knew the hole was deeper than I'd imagined. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain and realized he wasn't in bed. The clock read 2:15. I went to the window. His car wasn't in the garage. I waited motionless, until I heard the engine start. When he came in, barefoot and soaking wet, he looked at me and simply said,
"I couldn't sleep. I went for a walk."
I remained silent. The lie was already there. The next morning, he left early, leaving the same new scent in the air. I decided I wasn't going to stand still any longer. I called the number I'd saved as tire shop. The phone rang 3 times, and someone answered, a young, hesitant male voice.
Hello.
I was speechless. I recognized something in that timbre, but couldn't place it. The voice insisted.
Mr. Richard? Is that you?
I hung up without answering. My stomach churned. I sat up in bed, phone still in hand. That voice. There was something about it that belonged to me, even if I couldn't explain why. That night, Richard returned with a different look. He sat beside me, quietly. For a moment, I thought he was going to confess. But he simply asked me if I'd spoken to anyone from the workshop. I said no, feigning disinterest. He nodded slowly, as if confirming an old suspicion, and murmured,
"Okay then. He'll look for you tomorrow."
And it was at that moment that I realized, the story wasn't just between Richard and me. Someone else was about to enter, and with him, perhaps, the truth I wasn't ready to hear. One night, he left his cell phone on the living room table. We were having dinner, and I happened to notice the screen light up. The name Tire Shop flashed again, as if fate were determined to repeat the same scene. I stared at the phone for a few seconds, my heart racing, and this time I didn't hesitate. I picked up the phone and answered. On the other side, a young voice sounded, calm, confident enough not to imagine that it was me who was listening.
Hi, Mr. Richard. This is Ethan. I wanted to thank you for your help. My mom will never know. Okay?
For a moment, time stood still. The voice echoed within me like a sound that spans a lifetime before being recognized. Ethan. My son. My son from my first marriage. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, as if the world I knew had silently cracked. It took me a few seconds to react. I didn't hang up immediately. My breath was short. My hands were shaking. On the other end, he was still saying something, but the words came slurred, as if the air around me had become too dense to allow any comprehension. I pressed the button and ended the call. I stood there, staring at my phone as if it were still breathing. Every piece of the story of the last few days was coming together in a cruelly logical way. The envelope. The money. The messages. The outings. The tired tone. The voice. It all made sense now, a sense that ached. Richard wasn't cheating on me. He was hiding something from me that concerned my own past. Ours. I sat on the edge of the couch, trying to understand what that meant. He and Ethan had never gotten along. The new marriage, the moves, the distance. It had all taken its toll. I never imagined they'd spoken again, much less in secret. Minutes later, I heard the key turn in the door. Richard entered, calm, as if the world was still the same. He greeted me with a distracted smile, put his coat on the hanger, and asked if I wanted tea. I just watched him, my head too full to respond. As he prepared the water, I looked at him from a different angle. And I noticed something I'd never noticed before: the protectiveness in his voice, the lightness in his face when he thought no one was watching. It wasn't guilt. It was concern. When he sat down next to me, he simply said,
"I have to leave early tomorrow. There's something I need to take care of."
The phrase seemed harmless, but now I knew the weight it carried. He went to sleep soon after, and I remained in the living room, motionless, trying to sort everything out. The man I suspected of deceiving me was actually caring for the son I thought was distant. And he did it in silence, not to hide it from me, but to protect me from the pain. But something still didn't add up. If he was just helping Ethan, why so much caution? Why the encrypted messages, the hidden money, the late nights? The next morning, while he was showering, his phone vibrated again. A new message from Tire Shop. I opened it. He accepted the deal. He said he'll come to your house today. His throat went dry. The deal. What kind of deal? And most importantly, why would he come here? I confronted Richard the next morning as he prepared to leave. There was no scene, no shouting, no tears. Just a calm I didn't understand. He could tell from my gaze that I already knew, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't try to hide it. He sat at the table, folded his hands, and sighed before speaking. He said Ethan had come to him a few months ago, desperate, with a debt he couldn't pay. A mistake, a bad loan, something that could ruin him if it came to light. Richard had quietly helped, with money he'd been saving for years, and he'd done it without telling me because he knew if I found out, the pain of the past would come flooding back. She spoke slowly, like someone dismantling a lie piece by piece until only the truth remained. She said she didn't want me to relive the feeling of failure I'd felt when Ethan walked away, the guilt I'd carried for years, feeling like I'd failed as a mother. So she chose the loneliest path, solving everything without me being involved. She created a fake contact, took calls in secret, and even changed her work schedule so she could see him without arousing suspicion. I listened to it all in silence. Part of me wanted to hug him. Part of me wanted to scream. The truth is, I didn't know how else to react because, deep down, what destroyed me wasn't the secret, but his motive. He had done everything for me. For us. For a moment, Richard looked away, as if afraid to see me break. But I didn't cry. I just asked, "What now? Is he okay?" He nodded. He said Ethan had paid off his debt and promised to change. That he'd been trying to start over, quietly, away from everything that had lost him. The confession didn't bring immediate relief. It brought a strange emptiness, the kind of silence that comes when grief is still reorganizing. I looked at him, and saw a man who, despite all his mistakes, still carried a rare kind of loyalty, the kind that manifests itself in crooked but sincere gestures. Later, during dinner, silence filled the house again. The sound of silverware was the same, the air felt the same. But there was something different, something almost imperceptible. It was no longer the silence of distrust, nor the weight of lies. It was the silence that arises when the truth finally sits at the table and, for the first time, no one tries to move it. We ate slowly, exchanging brief glances, and I realized that fear had given way to something else, perhaps understanding, perhaps exhaustion. He got up first, washed his own dishes, and put his hand on my shoulder before leaving the kitchen. It was a brief touch, but real. The next day, Ethan called me. His voice, previously distant, was calm and steady. He said he was fine, that he owed everything to Richard's patience and mine, even though I didn't know it. I remained silent, my heart warm and my eyes teary. When I hung up, I saw Richard on the porch, tending the plants. The morning sun fell on him, gilding his gray hair. And I knew without words that the cycle had come to a close. Silence settled between us again. But this time, it was a good silence, the kind that hides nothing. The kind that simply means that, finally, life has found a way to begin again. And that's how it all ended, without any major explanations, without any drama, just a silent understanding that, in the end, that's what love is all about. Caring, even when the other person doesn't understand. If you've made it this far, perhaps you've felt the same knot, the same relief, or recognized something of this story in your own life. Leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end. I want to know who walked with me until the last line." And if these stories touch you, make you think, or simply remind you of something that time has almost erased, subscribe to the channel. This is where we talk about what's hidden between what's said and what's felt. Oh, and leave a like too. That way, YouTube understands that it's worth continuing to tell stories like this. Calm, human, and deep down, a little bit about all of us.